My name is Sophia, and for as long as I can remember, I learned to glide soundlessly through the rooms occupied by my own family. This skill was not born of timidity. Silence became my special optic, a lens through which I discerned the true contours of things, carefully concealed behind the facade of the mundane. This instinct, sharp and unerring, inevitably develops when your mother is a woman who adores control with the same passion she adores my younger sister, Emily. Before we continue, I'm very curious. What country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you're listening from. And now, let's continue. Emily, if you haven't guessed already, is the very sun around which my mother's cosmos revolves. She is 2 years younger than me, possessing that fragile, almost porcelain-like prettiness that, since the recent divorce, has become her main attribute and indisputable justification. And now, by the will of circumstances, I am living again in my mother's house, where every, even the most insignificant decision, from the choice of dinner menu to the volume of the television, is made in her favor and exclusively for her peace of mind. It has always been this way. In childhood, Emily received noisy celebrations, intense attention, soft, enveloping explanations for her whims. My lot was responsibility and endless paperwork. Paperwork. This phrase has haunted me longer and more obsessively than any other memories. When I was 19, my mother handed me a stack of update forms, insisting with a light, disarming smile that they were just boring government formalities, not worth any special attention. I signed because I trusted her, a blind, unreasoning trust one places in an unshakable authority. But I will never forget the tiny, barely noticeable logo in the corner of the page, which I recognized only years later when I was filling out documents myself at the insurance company in Denver. This realization etched itself into my memory like a deep bruise beneath the skin, invisible to outsiders, but impossible to brush aside because it aches with every movement, reminding you of what happened. Life in Denver granted me space and solid ground under my feet. I work as an analyst, and this profession has taught me not only to adhere to strict time frames, but also to identify the slightest inconsistencies, to notice when someone overlooks critically important details. It has honed my mind, made me more collected and perceptive, allowing me to understand people's hidden motives more deeply. However, no professional skill can prepare you for a return to the bosom of your own family. When Mom called about Thanksgiving this year, her voice sounded pointedly bright, almost theatrical, as if she had rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. She announced that the whole extended family would be gathering at Aunt Carol's house in Seattle. Cousins would flock there, venerable elder relatives, people who adore family drama more than traditional pumpkin pie. Mom mentioned that she had some important news and wanted everyone present for its announcement. That alone seemed strange to me. Usually, she avoided making any declarations unless they cast her in a favorable, almost heroic light. Aunt Carol's house had always been neutral territory, with its huge kitchen, long wooden table, and warm, cozy lighting. It was a place where you instinctively expected peace and tranquility, not a stern cross-examination. When I crossed the threshold of Aunt Carol's house that November evening, my mother was the first to greet me. Her hug was impulsive, almost nervous. Stepping back, she stared at me with that piercing, appraising look that had accompanied my entire childhood, a look that held a secret expectation that I would finally become the version of myself she had invented. The air was thick with laughter and conversation. Cousins crowded around the kitchen island, and booming Uncle Mike was already entertaining the crowd in the living room. The scene was painfully familiar, save for one detail. Her hands, those elegant, always so confident hands, were trembling. She endlessly smoothed the folds of her cashmere sweater, adjusted her pearl necklace, and this fidgety gesturing betrayed a nervousness she vainly tried to hide beneath a mask of warmth. A little later, Emily slipped into the room silently. Seeing me, she gave me a tired smile, which I automatically mirrored. But deep in her eyes there was a weariness, as if she had endured more than one sleepless night, bearing an unbearable burden on her fragile shoulders. Emily was never cruel by nature. Her flaw was a pliable will, especially when it came to our mother's influence. When the whole family settled around the long wooden table, I physically felt a change in the atmosphere. An unspoken tension hung in the air, hidden behind the clinking of crystal and the clatter of plates. Something important was approaching, and my mother desperately didn't want me to see it. But the truth, cold and irrefutable, was already in my phone, waiting for its moment. Hardly had the meal begun when the first alarm bell sounded, as customary to our family ritual as the aroma of evening coffee. It was disguised as a casual, almost offhand comment from my mother, which most present would have simply missed. But I spent years learning to hear the subtext in her words. And this phrase, something about how everything was finally settled, fell into the silence of my mind like a stone into still water, creating ripples of suspicion. She immediately steered the conversation elsewhere, and Emily, looking up at her in confusion, received no response. That was the first signal. The second came about 10 minutes later, when my cousin, known for his perceptiveness, leaned over and whispered, "Your mom seems really off her game today." I pretended to just shrug it off, but I had already noticed the oddities. Mom was barely touching her food. Her gaze kept sliding toward Emily, and at any mention of finances or documents, her shoulders involuntarily tightened. Under the cover of the tablecloth, I lifted my phone just enough to unlock the screen with my thumb. For several days now, an email from the insurance company had been sitting there, a polite but unambiguous notification about the initiation of an internal review, about the consideration of a filed claim. A claim filed by my mother. I didn't even need to open it fully. I knew every line by heart. Meanwhile, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Emily gradually beginning to realize that the picture of the perfect family was cracking. And something in Mom's story decidedly didn't add up. Emily leaned toward me so close that her whisper barely cut through the general hum. "Did Mom say anything to you about money?" she breathed, and her voice betrayed her with a tremble on the last word. She, the family's unquestionable favorite, was a bad actress. Her face, always an open book, at that moment expressed only the deepest confusion and anxiety. "No," I replied just as quietly, feeling a heaviness building in my temples. "Did she say something to you?" Emily just shook her head, and her eyes were bewildered. "She just keeps talking about some surprise, but I don't know anything about insurance." Insurance. That word tasted metallic and bitter on my tongue, becoming the third, brightest red flag. An illusion of celebration reigned around us. Forks clinked, chairs moved, Uncle Mike pompously dissected another work story, the elder relatives were hotly discussing football, and Aunt Carol, with her constant warmth, was offering everyone more food. No one suspected that the ground beneath our feet had already cracked, but I felt it in every cell. Something old, ugly, and well-known was rising from the depths. Then Mom repeated her maneuver. Leaning forward, she began speaking with heartfelt tenderness about how hard the past year had been for Emily. She didn't mention the divorce directly. There was no need. Her speech was a masterful sketch, portraying my sister as a fragile, victimized casualty of circumstances, deserving of special compensation. And in that moment, I recognized the tone. That same guilty, muted timbre I had heard 10 years ago in our kitchen when she slid those very update forms toward me and told me to sign before I forgot. Back then, I didn't understand the trick, but now I realized with absolute clarity. Her voice always sounded as if she were treading on shards of glass only she could see, and today her footsteps were deafeningly loud. I slowly, with deliberate serenity, folded my napkin, buying a few precious seconds. The machine of truth was already in motion. Mom was unraveling the tangle, thread by thread, and no one at that table, except me, understood what was about to happen. So when she finally raised her glass for a solemn announcement, I felt not a shred of shock. I was ready. Collapse never comes suddenly. It creeps up with small cracks, quiet, undeniable, perfectly visible to those who know how to look. Mom raised her glass again, trying to reclaim the control she always believed was rightfully hers. But her voice faltered on the very first word. The sound was barely perceptible, almost unnoticeable to an outsider's ear, but to me, it sounded like a crack from the very heart of the crystal glass. She cleared her throat convulsively, made a second attempt, and this time forced out a strained smile that never reached her frightened eyes. Without letting us delve deeper into the meal, Mom raised her voice, silencing even Uncle Mike. "I'd like to express gratitude for everything our Emily has been through," she proclaimed, and her gaze with theatrical pathos fixed on my sister, making her blink in complete bewilderment. She deserves something truly good, a new beginning, a bright patch in life. The fork in Emily's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "Mom, what are you talking about?" burst from her. But Mom ignored the question as if she hadn't heard. She continued speaking with measured, rehearsed phrases, as if reading from an invisible prompter. "Life has been unfair to her," she added, artificially softening her tone to elicit universal sympathy. "And when the opportunity arose, I did what any loving mother would do. I made sure she would be taken care of." It was a carefully constructed line of defense, a skillful justification thrown into the space before the truth could break free. And it was addressed not to Emily, but to all the spectators of this performance present. However, the audience was no longer on her side. Aunt Carol's brows furrowed in a stern crease. My cousin stopped eating, and Uncle Mike leaned back in his chair, his whole demeanor showing he expected the drama to continue. Even the elder relatives, who usually supported Mom out of habit, looked at her with wary, disapproving curiosity. "Mom, what opportunity?" Emily asked again, louder now, and the first notes of genuine alarm sounded in her voice. This was the first real breach in the maternal defenses. Mom tried to hold her ground. "It's all very complicated," she muttered in embarrassment, waving her hand with the familiar gesture that used to make everyone fall silent. But today, the gesture didn't work. Emily looked at her with a furrowed brow, as if seeing her for the first time. "What did you do?" I could have spoken up right then. I could have laid all my cards on the table. But true revenge, the kind that doesn't destroy you, requires icy composure. And I remained silent, letting the ringing silence work for me. In that silence, Mom began to panic. Her gaze darted in my direction. The next mistake was inevitable. "Sophia, you understand, don't you?" Her voice sounded strained and unnatural. "You know Emily needs help. There's nothing wrong with this." That was the second breach, her desperate attempt to drag me into her false narrative. She expected me, as at 19, to nod obediently, agreeing with what I didn't understand. Instead, I looked calmly, almost detachedly, into her eyes. "Why don't you explain it to everyone?" I asked softly. She caught her breath. Barely noticeably, but enough for everyone to see. Nothing changed physically, but the emotional atmosphere in the room broke definitively. People froze, holding a collective breath. Mom's voice became sharper, constricted. "There's nothing to explain," she blurted out, yet her hands told a completely different story. They trembled finely and helplessly. Emily looked at those trembling fingers, then at me. "Sophia," she whispered, and her voice held a chilling horror. "Did Mom file for a policy for Dad?" I didn't answer Emily. There was no need. My silence, heavy and meaningful, spoke louder than any words. The long overdue pause was interrupted by Aunt Carol, and her voice, firm and authoritative, cut through the tense atmosphere. "If there's something happening at this table that everyone should know about, now is the time to say it," she declared, looking straight at Mom. "Not after you've been hiding behind your daughter's backs all this time." Mom flushed, her eyes shooting daggers. "I haven't been hiding behind anyone," she retorted sharply, but her defense sounded weak and unconvincing. The room froze. The air grew thick as if before a storm. Mom was cornered, and I saw panic flash in her gaze. But I wasn't going to let her wriggle out, escape accountability. It was time to put an end to this lie. I slowly exhaled, finding inner calm. "We can talk about this," I said clearly, addressing everyone, "but let's be specific about what exactly was filed, and by whom." Mom's face turned as white as chalk. Her resistance began, not loud, not furious, but desperately precise, like a pinprick. And for the first time in many years, she realized with horror that she wasn't the only one in this family who understood the intricacies of paperwork thoroughly. Everything happened rapidly but not chaotically, as if a curtain had finally risen on an invisible stage, and all the actors instinctively took their places. Mom stood frozen, convulsively clutching the crystal glass in her fingers, and everyone at the table seemed to hold their breath, hoping one last time that she would find the words to glue the shards of the evening back together. But the thread of her lie was now too thin and worn. She opened her mouth but made no sound. So I took the floor. I didn't need to raise my voice. Truth doesn't need volume. It only needs the right moment. And now it was mine. "Mom," I said, striving for my voice to sound even and irrefutable, "why don't you tell them yourself who really filed that claim?" An absolute silence fell upon the room, in which only the flickering of the candle flames could be heard. Forks hung in the air. Someone's chair creaked plaintively, and one of the cousins slowly leaned back, unable to hide his shock. Even the warmth emanating from the kitchen seemed to freeze. Emily's eyes, sitting across from me, widened in horror. "What claim?" burst from her, and this question, much louder and sharper than she intended, became the battering ram that shattered the last remnants of control Mom was desperately trying to hold. Mom turned sharply to Emily. "Not now!" She tried to stop her, but it was too late. Emily jumped up from her seat, and her chair scraped loudly back on the wooden floor. "No, I want to know what she's talking about. What filing?" she demanded, and her voice trembled on the last word. Mom's lips visibly quivered. She shifted her gaze to me, and her eyes held a strange mixture of silent mourning and animal desperation. "Sophia, stop it. Don't be dramatic," she hissed. "You all don't understand anything." "No," I objected quietly, but very clearly. "And you know perfectly well I'm not being dramatic." Aunt Carol resolutely placed her palm on the table. She didn't raise her voice, but her authoritative presence alone demanded the truth. "I believe we all deserve to know what is happening here," she declared, and her words hung in the air like a final verdict. Mom swallowed with difficulty, and her voice sounded hoarse and unnatural. "It's just paperwork, nothing serious." And again that word, paperwork, the very incantation she used when I was 19, the very trick she always resorted to when one daughter needed to be silenced and the other kept blind. Slowly, without taking my eyes off her, I lowered my hand into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady and motionless, while her hands betrayed her with a tremor. "I didn't want to do this tonight," I said clearly, addressing everyone present. "But since you decided to involve everyone in this, they should hear the whole truth." Mom's eyes widened in horror. "Sophia," she tried to stop me, but it was too late. I touched the screen and opened the email I had reread dozens of times over the past 2 weeks. The subject line alone was enough to dispel the last shadows of doubt. "Review of claim submission pending." I didn't read every line, there was no need, but I voiced the most important part. "It states," I continued, and my voice sounded metallic and clear, "that I initiated an insurance payout on my father's supplemental policy, which was temporarily frozen. The company received a claim filed under his case, but they are investigating irregularities, specifically potential issues with the signature and beneficiary information." A hollow, muffled murmur ran around the table. Emily instinctively covered her mouth with her hand, and the knuckles of Mom's hands clutching the glass turned white with tension. "Sophia, you just don't understand how complicated everything is," she exhaled, and a desperate plea rang in her voice. "I understand," I interrupted her calmly, almost detachedly. "You filed the claim. You signed as the authorized contact. You listed Emily as the sole recipient. And you didn't tell any of us." Uncle Mike leaned forward, his eyebrows rising in amazement. "Wait a minute. She listed only Emily?" "Emily needs help," Mom's voice rose to a shout, stripped of all its former confidence. "Sophia has a job, her own life, a house in Denver." But Emily seemed not to hear these justifications. "Mom, you did this for me, without even telling me?" Her voice was full of genuine horror. "You filed something in Dad's name without even asking?" Mom tried to grab her hand, but Emily jerked back as if from a touch of red-hot metal. Tears glistened in her eyes, but these were not tears of weakness. They showed shock and deep devastation. How could you use his name like that? How could you hide all of this? Mom's voice broke into a whisper full of despair. I was trying to protect you. No, I objected quietly but inexorably. You were trying to control us. Both of us. Mom looked at me, and a strange, almost alien expression suddenly flashed in her gaze, as if she were seeing my face for the first time in a new, unfamiliar light she could no longer ignore. Why? She whispered, and her voice held not malice, but a bitter, bewildered revelation. Why did you go to them? Because they wrote to me, I replied, feeling a chilling clarity in every word spoken. To verify the signature, to confirm I knew what had been filed. And I didn't know, because you didn't tell me. Just like when I was 19 and you shoved those forms in front of me. Mom leaned back in her chair as if all strength had left her body at once. Her shoulders slumped inward, forming a pitiful, hunched silhouette. Aunt Carol, her stern expression unchanged, crossed her arms over her chest. You forged something, didn't you? Not for the first time, it seems. I didn't forge anything, Mom exploded. But this outburst was too swift, too defensive, too blatantly revealing the hidden truth. I just handled the paperwork because Emily had a terrible year. I thought I'd explain everything later when it was all settled. But you weren't going to explain, I parried, quietly but relentlessly. You would have let me find out the truth only when it was too late to change anything. Mom caught her breath. I was going to tell you both, she exhaled, but her words hung in the air, devoid of any conviction. And then Emily spoke, her whisper full of bitter insight. After the money landed in my account, after I became the villain in your story, not a participant in your project, that's when I would have found out. Mom winced as if from physical pain. The room buzzed with growing distrust. The elder relatives exchanged glances with silent condemnation. The cousins stared at their plates, avoiding her gaze. No one rose to her defense. For the first time in many years, the oppressive silence at the table was not my burden. It fell upon her with all its weight. I carefully placed my phone on the table, turning the screen with the email toward her. I didn't come here to humiliate you, I said, and my voice sounded surprisingly even. But you made public what you had no right to do, even in secret. Mom's eyes glistened with tears. Everything I did was for this family. No, I shook my head, maintaining composure. Everything you did was a pretense, an illusion that only you were holding this family together. Emily took a step back, wiping her wet face. I don't want this money, obtained through lies. Her words, quiet and clear, pierced not only the tense atmosphere of the room, but also, it seemed, our mother herself. It was visible in her posture, in how her hands finally dropped helplessly and were now raised not defiantly, but with an open, unconcealed tremble. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered, addressing me, and for the first time, her voice held not justification, but brokenness. I sighed, not with anger or triumph, but with a deep, long accumulated fatigue. You did hurt, but it doesn't have to stay this way. I allowed the room to breathe in this new reality, let it settle and take root in everyone's consciousness. This isn't revenge, I said, looking around at the familiar faces. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding in other people's filing cabinets. For a long time, no one moved. Then Aunt Carol silently reached under the table and squeezed my hand in her firm, warm grip. Emily exhaled shakily, wiping away the last tear, and Mom finally bowed her head in silent acknowledgement. It was a turning point, ripened not in shouting or accusations, but in the simple, inevitable weight of the truth, laid bare in the very place where she never expected to be held accountable. At that long wooden table in Seattle, the power she had so carefully built over the years slipped irrevocably from her hands. And for the first time, everyone present clearly saw who had truly been bearing the burden of preserving the family all along. The days following Thanksgiving took on a strange, ringing silence, that special mute emptiness that comes after a storm, having exhausted its fury, finally recedes, leaving behind a cleansed and hushed world. I returned to Denver with the same travel bag, but a silent revolution had occurred inside me, as if I had finally shrugged off the heavy burden that had been invisibly pressing on my weary shoulders since I was 19, when I was first handed those fateful forms. A week later, a call came from the insurance company. The voice on the other end informed me that their thorough review was successfully completed and the payout would not be directed to one person, as my mother had wanted, but would be divided strictly in accordance with the original policy terms, transparently and honestly, without shadowy manipulations or secret intentions. The representative politely apologized for the inconvenience, and I didn't explain to him that the source of all this confusion was not their bureaucratic machine, but the complex and damaged soul of the person closest to me. Emily called me that same evening, and her voice, uneven and agitated, sounded with that sincere, unclouded intonation I hadn't heard since we were carefree teenagers who hadn't yet learned the price of family secrets. She told me she had a long, difficult conversation with our mother, face to face, where she refused all her attempts to justify her actions and declared that she didn't want a single cent born of lies, and refused to live in that distorted version of our family where guilt and manipulation were presented in elegant packaging of care. Then, pausing, she said quietly but clearly, "I didn't expect this ending. Thank you for speaking the truth before it could consume us all completely." As for Mom, the consequences caught up with her swiftly and relentlessly. Our numerous relatives turned to me not for gossip, but with a sense of deep disappointment in her. And for a while, they kept their distance, giving her the space for reflection she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. She sent me a short, terse message that wasn't a full apology, but in it there was a bitter acknowledgement that her choices had consequences she could no longer ignore or control. I didn't respond with an angry message, nor did I rush to grant forgiveness, for some deep wounds require time, and some harsh truths need silence to settle in the mind and rebuild it from within. The most important thing was what turned out to be simple and clear. The lie had not won, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel defeated either. In the weeks that followed, I often thought back to how a single phrase, spoken aloud at the right moment, could overturn the entire foundation on which the family had rested for decades. And it wasn't a deafening shout, not a loud accusation, but a quiet yet inevitable truth, finally voiced where all interested parties could hear it. For me, that phrase changed absolutely everything. It couldn't fix the past or heal old scars, but it proved powerful enough to stop the vicious cycle of silence and manipulation. And sometimes, as I realized, that is enough, the quietest line capable of breaking a pattern that seemed unshakable.